your entire career. Everyone, I mean, the way that, I mean, the economy has changed, right? In the United States, for example, the main industries, it's really funny when I ask my students, that people are either going to work in knowledge industries, right? Like, technology, banking, professors, things like that, or they're going to work in service industry. And both of these are often, work is temporary, is mobile, is, and people change over time. And also multinational corporations that go beyond the nation state, etc. It's also a model, so it's a decentralized model. So another way that is a model of social organization is a kind of decentralization. So earlier in the class, we were talking about a simple example is the difference between the Cold War and the so-called war on terror, right? In the Cold War, you have one sort of enemy, right? I mean, it's kind of like, it's, you have, it just as if you have like Russia, the Cold War, or one specific enemy. Whereas the war on terror is difficult, and this is at least the way that it's presented, because there is no center, right? There is no center to the terrorists, right? I mean, the version of Al-Qaeda is that there are different cells, and they're rhizomic, right? There's no sort of logic. One cell might not know about any others, right? So that it becomes difficult to capture because there's no center. Also this notion that everything is surface, images, media, compression of time, space. David Harvey writes about that. Hybridity of culture, identity, ideas. Hui Baba is probably best known for that. It's also a model of power and resistance, right? So although many postmodernist theorists point out that postmodernism is already always implicated in that which it critiques, including Jameson and Linda Hutchins, it has sort of been offered, particularly in sort of gender, ethnic studies, post-colonial studies, as a model, not just a model, but the better model for resistance, right? So things like moving beyond a center-periphery model, right? Because power is not just top-down, but sort of suffused throughout culture, right? Or throughout the world. So it's going beyond the colonizer-colonized model to understand post-colonies situation in global capitalism and neo-imperialism and other kinds of things. It's also critical of political unity in the kind of classic example of the Communist Party, right? Like the old model is that you have to follow the party line or you're in trouble, versus a kind of postmodern idea of strategic alliances, right? Gayatri Spivak sort of known for this idea of strategic essentialism. Right? I mean, she's very vehement, even though she's a Marxist, that, in terms of actual organizing, it's always going to be contingent and temporary. And emphasis on difference, right? That the difference from the norms is important. And the dismantling, in feminism and multiculturalism or ethnic studies, this is often taken in the form of a rewriting historical texts, insisting on political epistemological difference, i.e., doesn't have as much with, but for example, like Asian American studies have a different knowledge system, or something like that. That would be a version of that. But postmodernism at the same time has also been characterized, again within these fields, but by different people, as itself male and patriarchal and white and Eurocentric, right? So if you're interested in particularly the way that postmodernism has been talked about in ethnic studies, there's a really good series of articles, Bell Hooks, Postmodern Blackness, and then Montedubé's sort of follow-up on that, and they talk about the ways that postmodernism has, theorized blackness, but then also how African American studies has sort of treated or incorporated or not incorporated or responded to postmodernism. And then, so it's a modal difference. And then postmodernism as aesthetic, right? So there's lots written on this. I find this the most interesting. But, it's anti-modernism, after-modernism. We were talking earlier in class today that I really like Brian McHale's account of the difference between modernist literature being about epistemological uncertainty you don't, you have this idea, like with Ulysses or with stream of consciousness, that something is actually happening out there, but you're just kind of seeing a filtered, view of it through the subject's point of view and something, right? Whereas something like Barbie's Rainbow, right? The question is not what's really happening here, right? Because you have a dog singing in the scene or something like that. The question is, what is, what world, as Brian puts it, what world are we in, right? And the more important question is not to figure out what's the real story here, but to understand how do those sort of ideological processes, discursive processes, how do they work in our world? Right. So this is just an overview. I know it's quick, but of the ways that the term postmodernism has been used. Its key features, I would say, are deep skepticism about our ability to know truth, decentralization, fragmentation, mutability, emphasis on surface, and more. So otherness postmodernism is what I call a group of critical tendencies in relation to race, ethnicity, and nation that privileges difference almost for its own sake. This tendency is manifested variously in post-structuralist, postmodernist, and sometimes even like self-professedly anti-theoretical positions. But although it takes different guises, otherness postmodernism is, or I would say more was, but kind of still is, ubiquitous in academic and public conversations about race in particular, and otherness and marginality in general. Otherness postmodernism encompasses a number of critical tendencies. It repeatedly pits sameness versus difference, unity versus heterogeneity, and singularity against multiplicity in a variety of ways, in terms of signification, determination, identity, social formation, literary form, and so on. Against a history of colonialism, patriarchy, white supremacy, nationalism, and other ideologies that have enforced historically sameness, a recurrent critical and political response has been to privilege difference, right? And you can see the logic for this. In ethnic and post-colonial studies, the work of Lisa Lowe, Paul Gilroy's later work, and Dr. Spivak, I would say, exemplify this tendency. In works that refer to economic and structural inequalities, repeatedly the greatest oppositional power is often given to the ability to avoid iteration, signification, identification, and definition. For instance, as opposed to raciology, or any kind of, what he calls raciology, raciology, raciology. And Gilroy defines this as any kind of racial thinking. Gilroy wants us to embrace a planetary humanism that would emphasize and celebrate hybridity, diaspora, fluidity, synchronization, and movement, right? And I mean, I'm a Gilroy fan, so I was like, he writes, by emphasizing diaspora, theories of identity turn instead toward contingency, indeterminacy, and conflict. But as Carol Boyce Davies points out, Gilroy's prescriptions are mostly culturalist, emphasizing, quote, style and performance, not active practices of power, and, quote, leaves the state and its practices intact while its black population is singled out for the most attack. By the same token, in response to Gilroy's polemic against the notion of victim as identity and the related arguments for compensation, David Palumbo writes, quote, that leaves us with the unrelenting, indelible historical fact that these people were aggrieved because of racial thinking on another's part, not necessarily their own, right? As a Marxist and critical humanist myself, I don't disagree with what Gilroy is trying to do here, but this critical proclivity for the sameness-difference dichotomy produces a number of intellectual problems. First, otherness postmodernism often fails to account for the structures and processes that produce the situation in which certain terms are articulated as, on the one hand, self or central or same, while others are other or marginal or different. Secondly, the overly simplified sameness-difference self-other binary ends up consistently privileging difference. A perfectly unified, totalized, or homogeneous social phenomenon, whether we're talking about societies or a person or whatever, there's no such thing. So So the default choice is always going to be difference, heterogeneity, others. But without accounting for anything other than, say, total unity on one hand and heterogeneity on the other, the default choice becomes that of difference. Third, when formalized, sameness versus difference dichotomy fails to provide the ground for evaluation between social articulations by appeal to, for example, ethics, referentiality, or meta-narratives. Because otherness postmodernism offers no guide for evaluating cultural practices and productions other than that sameness difference dichotomy, postmodernism itself becomes the only means for progressive politics and theoretical sophistication. So looking back, the headlines of my specific argument makes more sense in historical context, right? Always historicize. I wrote Critiquing Postmodernism, as I was in the class earlier. I was really kind of writing it in response to the 1990s. There's a couple of reasons. I could not bear to listen to another paper about how X or Y, minority or female or queer author, was using experimental aesthetics, experimental aesthetic techniques in order to subvert nationalism or patriarchy or capitalism, imperialism, and other dominant ideologies that have been, maybe in the past naturalized through literary realism. This was an argument that was replicated over and over and over. I was also very tired of, in ethnic and postcolonial studies, the constant reiteration of a chronology in which the pre-postmodernist days, particularly the 1960s and 70s, were constantly characterized as essentialist, nationalist, and reactionary. There are a bunch of essays in ethnic studies that talked about, we were wandering in the wilderness and then we found, post-structuralism or postmodernism, and now we're theoretically sophisticated. So I used, came up with this purposely ugly, clunky term of postmodernism, or otherness homo, which is meant to name something that was ubiquitous but somehow unassailable. Although I think this has changed somewhat, at least in cultural studies. I'm seeing more different kinds of stuff now. The problem with otherness homo, other than its fatiguing repetitiveness, is that it is what Zizek calls an ideological fantasy. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because it tends to lead down an Orkanian rabbit hole. But in a nutshell, this is Zizek's Orkanian Marxist response, the Orkanian Marxist Althusser's response to Marx. So the traditional Marxist notion of ideology assumes that it's false consciousness, right? Like your actual consciousness should be based on your class position, particularly the proletariat. They should be against capitalism because it's exploiting them. And any idea otherwise, it's false, right? So the idea is that if people were simply educated and informed about how the world works, they would change it. Against this notion, drawing on Lacan, Althusser contended that ideology constitutes the subject for imaginary relations to the real conditions of existence. In other words, power interpolates us and creates our subjectivity, and we misrecognize ourselves in the state and church, or state of the church, or what have you, right? So, in turn, Zizek argues that ideology is not simply this imaginary relationship to reality. Rather, ideology is itself the notion that social reality relies on fantasy. In other words, the fantasy that he's talking about is the idea that we can escape from ideology. He argues that ideology is not only what people think or know or believe, but also, even primarily, what we do, right? Belief, Zizek writes, is not merely an individual or purely mental state, even in relation to the state, for example. Rather, quote, it is always materialized in our effective social reality. Belief supports the fantasy, which regulates the social reality, close quote. For example, he demonstrates how, for example, despite our understanding of the materiality, of the symbolic value of money, right? Nobody actually thinks that a quarter is inherently has some kind of magical value, right? We all treat it as a real abstraction or as a kind of universal value. We treat it as if it's real. I also use the example of citizenship, right? I mean, I might have a critique of the nation state and national borders and stuff like that. But when I travel, I still take my passport, right? So, right? And he says that ideology's level of ideology has become so normalized. We don't even think of it as ideological anymore. He says that our non-knowledge is required for this. Even if we know that money does not have inherent value, our actions constitute the social reality that in turn relies on the consistency of our actions with ideological directives, whether we believe it or not. And then he talks about he draws on Sloterdijk's critique of civil but anyway. In the case of otherness postmodernism, the argument that I made in the book was that the fantasy that the postmodernist sees through the mistaken ideas that the credulous essentialist believes. The postmodernist presents him or herself as resisting racism and other kinds of exploitation, primarily by disbelieving the ideologies, the logic of the ideologies that the credulous essentialist presumably accepts. The postmodernist faith in the seeing through as not just a political litmus test, but the most important determinant of epistemologically sophisticated progressive politics, as evidenced by controversies in the late 20th and early 21st centuries over left conservatism, there's a whole debate, and then postmodernism is a form of the fantasy that ideology works primarily through our belief or intention, rather than also through our actions as shaped by institutional forces and the threat of violence or privation, right? So my example is, I don't just, I don't excuse myself from this because I'm also embedded in these same systems of power, but the example would be a critic who was otherness postmodernist or something, but still continues to live the life of kind of overconsumptive first world, academic or something like that, right? I mean, it's, just being, just pointing out the ideology, the epistemologies is important, but it's not enough in and of itself. So that is the problem with otherness postmodernism. It focuses on belief rather than the reality that problematic racializations, essentialist or not, remain endemic, structuring our societies, practice, and beliefs. So, for example, despite its critique of the logic of signification, otherness postmodernism shares fundamental assumptions with a kind of liberal multiculturalism prevalent in the US and other Western countries today. Both otherness postmodernism and multiculturalism rely on false binaries between sameness and difference that ironically flatten both of those concepts. Sameness is one thing and difference is just this other thing. Liberal multiculturalism, with the best of intentions, posits the sameness of a monocultural society against the difference of multiculturalism. Stella Benavide points out that such strong, or what she calls mosaic multiculturalism, is impossible because the constituent groups are not clearly delineated and identifiable, right? I mean, it's not like, African Americans, one discrete group, Asian Americans, one discrete group, Native Americans, one discrete group, all of these things, as we know, are much more complex. Multiculturalism, also like otherness postmodernism, exalts difference for its own sake without considering how, why, and what are the reasons for and consequences of different kinds of differences. Yisan Wang, one of the most trenchant critics of both postmodernism and multiculturalism, describes liberal multiculturalism as a fantasy in which plural cultures of ethnicities coexist peacefully without serious contestation in a free play of monads, the best of all possible worlds. The multiculturalist or cosmopolitan arena is, quote, a bazaar for anyone who can buy, although some goods are not as valuable as others. This mode of appropriation, Simon argues, quote, fetishizes or commodifies others, right? And this is basically what I'm arguing with otherness postmodernism is doing. In a kind of understandable remedy, it's kind of, again, I think this made more sense in the 90s because there's more options today, but just continually fetishizing and celebrating this difference. Some versions of multiculturalism may grant cultural autonomy, but, quote, hide or ignore structural inequalities under the umbrella of a refurbished humanist cosmopolitanism. Postmodernism, moreover, can be as useful to the right as the left. In some instances, I think the right across various parts of the world have become better postmodernists than progressive intellectuals because we're still trying to justify our politics, things like that. Some neoconservatives, or just far right, not even yet conservatives anymore, now claim to agree about the impossibility of fixing signification in universals, the importance of privileging local contexts and genealogies, and the necessity of being pragmatic and strategic. They don't say so outright. Even if they don't say so outright, they have certainly proven their ability to become freed from any fidelity to greater or lesser accuracy. It is telling to examine their actual intents, interests, and actions. Neoconservative strategic postmodernists constantly re-articulate and change the terms of the discussion as it suits their interests, drawing sometimes on the rhetoric of multiculturalism and postmodernism. For example, you've probably heard of the intelligent design debate, right? Which, some people literally made their argument for inclusion in schools based on equal representation, or teaching the conflicts, right? Rather than putting the focus on the scientific credibility of intelligent design, and the same thing can be said for climate change, it became about pluralism and diversity. Such arguments are, of course, strategic. The right's tactical use of postmodern and multicultural logic does not mean that they're actually looking for a kind of multicultural world. Rather, the appeal to multiculturalism or equal representation is a strategy within a particular historical political situation. Conservatives know that many people in the First World have imbibed the tenets of multiculturalism and the underlying postmodernist notions of cultural relativism and even social constructionism, right? This is why people say racism exists, right? Race is just construction. This becomes then another form of anti-racialism, which I'll talk about in a second. Others, of course, are just plain old-fashioned racism. One of the most blatant examples of strategic postmodernism can be found in the concept of postmodern empire. This is a thing. When I found out, I was like, what? So Robert Cooper, senior British diplomat and one of Tony Blair's chief advisors, called for a new postmodern imperialism in the April 2002 issue of The Observer. Cooper's essay was then reprinted in the humbly titled volume, Reordering the World. Cooper describes, quote, post-imperial, postmodern states as those that no longer think of security primarily in terms of conquest, right? So these are post-imperial, postmodern states. And they're characterized by, quote, the rejection of force for resolving disputes and the constant codification of self-enforced rules of behavior, as well as, quote, the growing irrelevance of borders, right? So they're basically saying, these are the rule of law and, internationalist part of globalization. For such states, security, quote, security is based on transparency, mutual openness, interdependence, and mutual vulnerability, right? So this includes the UK and the United States. The states stuck in the pre-modern modes, primarily in the Third World, threaten the postmodern world. In such a climate, Cooper writes, the West needs to stop worrying about universalism or justice or ethics or something like that. He writes, quote, the postmodern world has to start to get used to double standards. Among ourselves, we operate on the basis of laws and open cooperative security. But when dealing with old-fashioned states outside the postmodern continent of Europe, we need to revert to the rougher methods of an earlier era: force, preemptive attack, deception, whatever is necessary to deal with those who still in the 19th century world of every state for itself. Cooper's claims are a thinly veiled justification for neo-imperialism. It's a way to talk about race without being racist. It's imperialism without imperialists. His division of the world is based on a progression that ignores interlinked histories. For example, if you haven't read Ngugi Wa Devil on the Cross, you should go out and read that right now. Moreover, his actual criteria, as discussed in the essay, Cooper's essay, is his actual criteria for postmodernity is power, right? Whoever has power is postmodern. So underlying this postmodern, pre-modern schema is the clash of cultures rhetoric that draws on multiculturalist notions of various cultures that are not interlinked or variously related historically. Okay, so this is the last bit I'll talk about because I think it's very useful. A more recent, and what I think is maybe an even better way to understand some of these issues, is David Theo Goldberg's concepts of how anti-racism has given way to anti-racialism, or an opposition to the concept of race altogether. In The Threat of Race, Reflections on Racial Neoliberalism, which the students read for class, Goldberg argues that, at least in cosmopolitan public rhetoric, left-right consensus has risen that has embraced anti-racialism at the expense of anti-racism. Goldberg distinguishes anti-racialism, or a rejection of racial categories altogether from a variety of motives, but it's a rejection of racial categories altogether, from anti-racism, which seeks to identify and battle systemic injustices tied to race. Historically, sometimes anti-racialism and anti-racism have gone hand in hand, right? Like deconstructing, essentialism, that can be a good thing, right? Like not all Asians are the same, right? Historically, but this is not, as he points out, this is not necessarily always the case. He writes, anti-racialism is to take a stand, instrumental or institutional, against a concept, a name, a category, right? It's to question, but also possibly be against the concept of race altogether. And you can see why that would be the case. Has anyone ever read any of the 19th century eugenics texts? Like Walter Scott's, like The Rising Tide of Color. I mean, you can't make that stuff up. I love it, Victoria. They were by far the weirdest people that ever lived anywhere on the face of the planet since the beginning of time. So I include the postmodern, because the Victorians were very weird. Anyway, but so in that context, you can see why kind of anti-racialism would be, attractive. Anti-racism, by contrast, conjures a stance against an imposed condition or set of conditions. An explicit refusal or a living of one's life in such a way one refuses imposition, whether one is a member of the subjugated population or the subjugated one. It is an insistence that one not be reduced, at least not completely, to or by the implications marked by the imposition and constraint, by the devaluation and attendant humiliation. Right? And he goes on to talk about sometimes this means accepting the possibility of death. Right? Anti-racist movements, including, he goes on this history of abolitionist movements around the world, anti-colonial and civil rights struggles, and anti-apartheid movements sometimes overlap with anti-racialism, but again, not always. Today, he argues, anti-racialism has taken precedence over anti-racism. Right? So, he writes, in the wake of whatever nominal successes, anti-racist struggle, he talks specifically about sort of the 60s, 70s civil rights and anti-colonial, but also then like the anti-apartheid struggles of like 80s and 90s and stuff. Anti-racist struggle gave way in each instance to anti-racial commitments at the expense of anti-racist effects and ongoing struggle. Right. So, for example, whereas anti-racism requires remembering and recalling, anti-racialism advocates forgetting, getting over, moving on, wiping away the terms of reference, and at best or worst, a commercial memorializing. Right? Anti-racialism denies continuing structure, or at least the dominant form today, denies continuing structures of inequality and exploitation, hampering our ability to recognize institutionalized inequality and change the systems in which racial categories continue to constitute a repressed and sometimes not so repressed term. Ramon Saldivar has said something similarly about what characterizes the nature of race and processes of racialization today are post-civil rights apathy, colorblind racism, or racism without races. Right? In neoliberalism, crude, direct racism is cast as pre-modern or private and individual and merely effective. And such old-fashioned racism is denied as a central aspect of global capitalism. The new world order claims to be colorblind. The understanding of race has moved from the broadly institutional to the micro-relational. So again, it's individual, affective, private, irrational thing. Success in doing away with the legal superstructure of racial subjugation gave way, or in, quite quickly, to concerns not so much over differential economic or social access and possibilities as considerations of racial categorization and classification, racial preferences, and group conceived possibilities. And he is taking the task to some degree, academics, because he later says, while it is important to analyze culture and discursive creations, we also need to sort of look at this very institutional, boring, like laws, education, those kinds of things. At the same time, large-scale geopolitical racialism continues in the form of culture wars, i.e. Islamophobia, and rhetorics of development that see certain nations and cultures as developmentally and socially backward, rather than, the various countries linked together in a long history of global circuits systems. Anti-racialism works well with neoliberalism and globalization, purporting to embrace formal legal and economic equivalence, but leaving the